Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's Friday afternoon in August, and I'm delighted that your summer vacation plans include CSIS. But it's really a testament to how important, influential, and respected our panel today is. I'm Mike Green. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair here at CSIS, Professor at Georgetown. Before we get started, we always do a brief safety announcement. We have about 10 four-star admirals and generals in the room, but this former Boy Scout will be in charge. If there is a need to evacuate, and I'll let you know, but we'll head out and head around the corner to National Geographic down 17th Street, out the back. We have simultaneous interpretation, and there should be headsets on your chair. If you have any problems, just wave and someone will come and help you. Please leave them on the chair when you're finished. If you take them home, then we will send the new Defense Force Rapid Deployment Force to your house to retrieve them tonight. So we're here to hear from 8 distinguished former flag officers from the United States and Japan who participated in this year's U.S.-Japan Military Statesmen Forum, which was established by the Asia-Pacific Initiative and Yoichi Funabashi, who I will introduce now, who will tell you what we have been up to the past few days. Dr. Funabashi is very well known in Washington and around the world. He's an award-winning journalist, columnist, and author. He's written extensively on international affairs, on the U.S.-Japan alliance, geoeconomics, China, geostrategic and geopolitical dynamics in Asia. He was correspondent for Asahi Shimbun here in Washington, 80 to 81. In Beijing, 80 to 81, Washington, 84 to 87, and he was the bureau chief here, 93 to 97, when I was a graduate student at CSIS, and he had a great Hay Adams Forum, where he would take the Japanese-speaking graduate students, younger military officers, foreign service officers, and when the Prime Minister of Japan, the Foreign Minister came to Washington, he always made them sit down for breakfast with us in Japanese, which was wonderful. He's been a great mentor and friend to many of us in this business, and today hires Georgetown grads of mine, and we have had probably 10 people go back and forth between his Asia-Pacific Initiative and CSIS and Georgetown. API was founded after 3/11 as the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation did a really seminal report on what happened with that triple tragedy and how we responded, and then changed the name in 2017 to Asia Pacific Initiative because the mandate has broadened to a whole range of geopolitical and economic issues. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished first speaker, Yoichi Funabashi.
Thank you, Mike, for your generous introduction. I'm very glad to be here. On behalf of the Asia Pacific Initiative Foundation, I would like to express my deep appreciation to CSIS, Dr. Joe Hamre, Dr. Michael Green, and the others for hosting us. Asia Pacific Initiative Foundation was founded in 2011 after the 3/11 tragedy. We published a report on Fukushima nuclear disaster. And in that report, we emphasized the critical role which Japan's self-defense forces and the U.S. military played in fighting against adversity. Particularly, we are very much grateful for the United States dispatching more than 20,000 Marines immediately to the disaster area for rescue operation. That crisis was that most existential national crisis for Japan over the past 70 years. And it was that self-defense forces and the US military, actually, which really saved Japan. That was a rude awakening to us Japanese. So I thought that, I think military to military dialogue and policy dialogue also will be very much crucial for the future of Japan and the US-Japan alliance. That's the backdrop of why we initiated this endeavor to launch the Japan-U.S. Military Statesmen Forum. The core group members were, and still are, the retired admirals and generals, both Japan and the United States. But over the past 6 years, it has expanded, that scope of the participation has expanded to include the active duty officers and civilian policymakers and the policy experts. And we have been very much extraordinarily fortunate to have that government officials, both from the United States and Japan, for this year's 6th Military Statesmen Forum. And we have had very fruitful, stimulating policy discussions over the past 2.5 days. So I once again very much appreciate the full members and guests of Military Statesmen Forum to come to Washington to get together, to exchange views and notes in a very much informal, off-the-cuff manners. Mike Green has been very much extremely helpful from day one. Actually, Dr. Hamre and Dr. Green extremely instrumental to bringing about this enterprise. And so without Dr. Hamre's strong endorsement, this would never have started. And also without Dr. Green's continued support, it would never have grown to this extent. So once again, thank you very much for Dr. Green and Dr. Hamre and CSIS. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Yoichi. We're going to turn now to a panel discussion. I'll ask a series of questions to our distinguished visitors, and we'll try to save some time to open it up for your questions. There's a lot of experienced people in this alliance in the audience, I see, so I look forward to that. Let me introduce briefly the panel. So to my immediate right is Admiral Mike Mullen, who serves now on the boards of directors for Sprint and the Bloomberg Family Foundation, and on the advisory boards of TechMet and Affinity. He retired from active duty in 2011 after having served as the 17th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States after 43 years of service in the US Navy. To his right is General Yoichi Oriki. He is now a special advisor to Japan's National Security Council staff. He retired from active duty in 2012 after serving as the 3rd Chief of Staff in Japan's Joint Staff, which of course was during 3/11. And he had to show leadership for the Japanese people, the self-defense forces, and in our alliance, and earned enormous respect for that. Saw the self-defense forces rise to be the most respected institution in Japan in public opinion polls. To his right is Admiral Denny Blair, well known to many of us here, chairman of the board and distinguished senior fellow of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Admiral Blair served as director of national intelligence from 2009 to 2010. He had a distinguished active duty career in the US Navy, retired in 2002 after 34 years, including as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command. To Admiral Blair's right is General Shigeru Rocky Iwasaki, Japan Air Self-Defense Force. He's now Special Advisor to the Cabinet. He retired from active duty in 2014 after serving as the 4th Chief of Staff of Japan's Joint Staff and the 31st Chief of Staff for the Japan Air Self-Defense Forces. To his right is General Vincent Brooks, who currently serves on the Board of Directors of the Gary Sinise Foundation. He served as the 15th Commander of the UN Command, the Combined Forces Command, and U.S. Forces Korea during a very consequential time from 2016 to 2018. And before that was, I think, the first USAR PAC 4-star in command of U.S. Army forces in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. And last but not least, Admiral Katsutoshi Kawano. He's now Executive Advisor to the Ministry of Defense. He retired from active duty in 2019 after serving as the 5th Chief of Staff for the Joint Staff Office from 2014 to 2019, and before that, Chief of Staff for the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces. So this is a very distinguished panel with a lot of experience across a whole range of security challenges that have confronted our countries. I'm going to open, if I could, by asking Admiral Mullen and General Oriki, who co-chair this Military Statesmen Forum, just to give us the 2 or 3 top takeaways that you have from the past 3.5 days of discussion that we've had. And I'll start with you, Admiral, if I may.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for your leadership and continued participation and support of this forum. I think with respect to the last 2.5 days, the number one takeaway for me has been the ability to frankly explore in depth and in breadth the issues that with which the alliance is challenged. I can tell you this is, I think, my 4th year, and each year it's gotten deeper and broader, and actually they're much more frank discussions, very rich in terms of the challenges, and we'll talk about some of those, but more than anything else, there's a trust here that's very real. It happens very quickly once the conference starts, and it's really bred out of friendship, long-term relationships, and a passion and a commitment to the U.S.-Japanese alliance, even though that is what we talk about is broader than just the alliance itself. It's particularly important to me, not just because of my long-standing relationship with Japan, but at 311, while I had known General Riki, who was my counterpart when I was chairman, we went through, he led in that crisis like very few leaders I have seen globally over the course of my career. And so to be paired with him again in this kind of forum was very special. So that's the breadth and the depth, I think, is the first thing. Secondly is, and I try to follow things geostrategically, but I had no idea that the relationship between Japan and Korea had deteriorated so badly. And we're at a real low. We could argue about whether it's an all-time low. And when you incorporate the overall geostrategic criticality of that area of the world, this particular challenge, which is not new, but this particular challenge just opens the door for China to drive right through it. And that's what's going on right now, to the detriment of South Korea, to the detriment of Japan, to the detriment of the alliances, and to the detriment of the region. So I was very struck by that. We had some very healthy discussions with respect to it. This to include a very clear representation on the Japanese side that right now in Japan we're at what I would call sort of Korea fatigue. We cannot let Korea fatigue and all that is associated with that stop us from the point of achieving a solution here pretty quickly. And as was pointed out earlier today, this has seen the political support for both leaders go up, which is an incentive not to solve it, and yet, longer term, the dangers are pretty significant. So that came loud and one of the points that was made is Korea needs the time right now to be able to work through this, and from my standpoint, Japan needs to give them the space without overreacting in what has moved to what I would call sort of the emotional phase, in which when we're operating in that phase, it's not very likely anything good is going to come out of that. So I hope the Korean and the Japanese leadership can actually pause, get to the point where they can pick up meaningful, constructive negotiations and resolve this as rapidly as possible. And I'm sure you'll hear more about Korea. The third thing, and I'm sure someone will talk about China, but the third thing, the takeaway is China. It's all about China in that region, in many ways, to include our relationship and what's going on there. But this is more of an operational warfighting focus. We've met many years. We've talked about figuring out how to work together and both exercise together, which generates a much stronger deterrence against the potential outbreak of conflict, but it also puts you in a much better position if conflict should break out. And that's very real. My takeaway, again, from this week was that there needs to be a sense of urgency on how we plan and exercise together, not just Japan and the U.S., but also our coalition partners, and to do that pretty quickly. We are challenged, as we always are, in this kind of potential warfare with information sharing. That's built on trust. We talk routinely about these gray zone wars, cyber, electronic warfare, what's going on in space, and we had pretty healthy discussions about that. Those are all incredibly complicated domains, and we've got to get to work to have more, again, planning and exercising in these domains to understand how we're going to operate together. My experience is that if you've done none of that and conflict breaks out, it gets it gets very bad before it gets better. You can mitigate a lot of that with practice ahead of time. That also puts a lot of pressure in the region on China, which I think is exactly what we need to do. So those are the three things.
Excellent. Thank you. Ruiki-san.
はい。私の方は日本語で喋らせていただきます。
Speak to you in Japanese today. And we are very grateful that there are many participants here today. Regarding what we are trying to carry out, I believe that Admiral Mullen had covered them comprehensively, therefore there is not much that I need to add. However, when I was still on active duty with Admiral Mullen, I had been blessed to work with him very much. And as was mentioned by Dr. Funabashi, at the time of 3/11, when we encounter a major disaster, as a top of the U.S. military, Admiral Mullen had really provided us with strong support. And we have been able to develop a personal trust relationship, which I personally believe is extremely strong. However, we can say the relationship during active duty and when we are retired are somewhat different. That is, we carry out the same mission in the same environment. But once you are retired, I believe that maybe you will have different view and perceptions. And in that regard, with the use of the forum such as MSF, I think we can further the trust relationship that we had and build on it. And I had participated in MSF 6 times, and I have been able to feel that this being strengthened. I do not know how Admiral Mullen feels about me, but I fully have a total trust in him. And with such a relationship, if you look at the South China Sea or activities of the Chinese armies, from the military perspective, I think we can share more even now. Not necessarily just sharing the information, but I think we can sort of perceive and recognize the information. And I believe that this forum has given us the opportunity to be able to sort of share that kind of perception even before the information. Each time, as I participate from the U.S. side and from the SDF, we do have more active members participating. We started that we will have this forum between the retired officers, and we will talk about the government policies, as well as what the Japanese as well as U.S. active duty military can cooperate. And we wanted to provide a bridge between these people. That was the original objective, and I believe that we have been able to accomplish that. Earlier, there was some reference to Japan-Korea relationship. Although I will not be talking about relationship with South Korea, since from 3 years ago, we have Admiral General John participate in this forum. In that sense, as well, we can have the objective exchange of views. I believe Japan-U.S. ROK, although we only have one participant from ROK, I believe that participation is of extreme importance. And this year, we had an Australian guest also take part in our meeting. So although it started with U.S. and Japan, now we do have Korea, South Korea, as well as Australia, and there are 4 countries involved in this forum. And maybe the original intention and objective may have changed a little bit, but as the situation and environment changes extremely fast, I believe we are now meeting the needs of the time, and I believe that that results in an extremely important result. So that is my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn to Admiral Blair and General Iwasaki. You get the hard question. With the militarization of these artificial islands in the South China Sea by the PLA, the unifying of commands on the Chinese side, the increasing operational tempo in the East China Sea, not only operating in the first island chain, but now beyond the first island chain. This is an enormous problem. Some people say we have lost the South China Sea and we are losing the East China Sea. So starting with you, Admiral Blair, is that right? How would you characterize it?
No, it's wrong.
Thank you.
Let me go a little beyond that. Wonderful to have former Secretary, former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills here with us. She and I co-chaired back around 2003 a study on the future of U.S.-China relations. And a couple of conclusions that we reached back then I think are still very important. We agreed that the only country that could contain China was China. And our policy at that time was to try to give China room so that it would not contain itself, that it would join the world-based order from which it had benefited so strongly up to that time, ever since Deng Xiaoping opened it to the world. But what I now see China doing is in the process is containing itself. They are taking such aggressive action against such a wide range of areas that the countries of the region who are there, the countries outside the region, but nonetheless have presence and interest and vital interest in the area, are are really banding together to oppose this Chinese very aggressive posture from the military point of view, from the economic point of view, from the diplomatic point of view. So a few small islands in the southern part of the South China Sea are really inconsequential compared to at the strategic level, a unified concern about China and banding together in order to offset and to contain this offensive by China. So I think basically China is causing a reaction now, which it will regret. Now, in my experience, the Chinese are very practical, and if something that they are trying is not working, they will try something else. And there are certainly elements within China who think that, the more we're aggressive, the more we push, the more we demand, the more we bully, we'll get a point where all of these other countries will just say, okay, you're the big guy, we'll just do whatever you want. I don't think that's the way it's going to turn out. I think the countries of the region and those of us who are allies of the countries in the region, who are partners and who support them, will show China that this is a losing strategy that they are on, and that they will say, okay, it was working better last time when we tried to work with the organization and try to make changes in a peaceful and non-coercive, non-bullying bullying manner, and we will get back to that point. On the specific issue in the South China Sea, there is far more military activity by other countries, the United States, Japan, Australia, France, the UK, than there was a while ago. Why? Because China has raised its tempo there. In the East China Sea, again, Japan is building whole classes of ships. Japan is forming new types of military operations, amphibious brigades that they were not doing before in reaction to this Chinese side. And the net effect of what China has done is at the tactical, operational, military level, they have gained no advantage, and at the strategic level, they have begun to box themselves in and to set a big disadvantage. So that's why my answer was no.
Good. Thank you.
はい、ありがとうございます。ブラテ特が今長く話してしまったので、質問が何だったかちょっと。
I believe that Admiral Brea talked quite a long time, so I sort of forgot the question. But in thinking about China, we need to fully understand what kind of country China is. Many times, the Chinese people say that we have history of 4,000 years. And the Chinese people are the type of people who look at things with a very, very long-term view and think about it with long years in mind. I believe it was in 2008, General or Admiral Keating was present, I believe, in 2008, that he visited China, and Admiral from the Chinese Navy said that the Chinese Navy will not be able to control the eastern side of Hawaii. Therefore, I will have to ask you to take care of that. But on the west side of Hawaii, we will take care of it. Therefore, don't worry. And I believe that Admiral Keating said that he did not know what this Chinese was talking about. He was not talking about, this admiral from Chinese Navy was not talking about 10, 20 years, maybe 50 years and 100 years was in his mind. From 1950 to 55, they actually came up with the Territorial Waters Act. And this is a domestic law, not much influence outside of China. But as you know, there was a first line as well as a second line island chain. And the first island chain, I think it was about, they were thinking about 2010. And they were going to control inside of the first island chain by China. And when you look at the status and the capability of the Navy of 1990, we did not think that they could go outside of their immediate territory, but they were saying that within 20 years they will be in control of the first island chain.
So this island chain covers a very close islands to Japan, but China's PLA Navy, they are very confident about in the future they will be taking control in this area. At that time, we did not believe this Chinese officer at all, but let's look at 2010 and on. China has made passage to western side of the Pacific Ocean. And also, more than 10 times every year, they pass this strait and then also this island chain to come to near Iwo-jima Island. With their behaviors like this, when we think about midterm to long term, we think about 5 years, 10 years. But to Chinese mind, it's about 50 years to 100 years. And so China has a long game in their mind. And so when we think about China, we need to remind us about that. And also when we think about Chinese political system, and we are a democratic country, of course, but when China thinks about their armed forces, but in Japan, for the self-defense force, we have to negotiate our budgetary needs every year to the legislative branch, and we make plans, and then the executive branch, they will execute the policy and also initiatives. And so we have to take 2 to 3 years to implement the actual ideas that came out of 1 year. But when you think about Xi Jinping, he can make an order and then that will happen on the next day. So that's the situation in China. And when I look at China's behavior, so are you saying I should stop? Should I stop? So China is really good at where power vacuum is. That may be political, military, and also economy. And they can find those vacuum points so that they can expand themselves into those. And this happens in the East China Sea, coming close to the Senkaku Islands. And typical one is the South China Sea. Without our knowledge, China has been making reclamation to make an artificial feature and also runway and also anti-air assets and such. And so that they have been able to take or seize that part of the ocean. So we have to think about how they think about this game, and also we'll be able to handle that. So Dr. Green talked about this question that if the East China Sea and also the South China Sea are lost to China, my answer, I completely agree with Admiral Blair. My answer is no. China, even though that China has made the approach to the Senkaku Islands, but we, of course, provide 24/7 patrol to protect our land. So we have a similar capability in terms of patrol ships. And we have been using our military or defense capability to protect these islands. And we have seen many invasions or approaches from the China's vessels. And so So China has been taking rotations, which kind of ships that they use to keep their constant presence near the Senkaku. But Japan is not backing down at all because we provide continuous patrol around this area. In terms of the South China Sea, we respect the sovereignty of each country. And China's occupation is illegal, but I do not think that these seas are not lost to China at all.
Admiral Kawano about that. The U.S.-Japan alliance was negotiated and signed in the middle of the Korean War, and the U.S.-ROK alliance right as it ended. If the U.S. and UN forces had not been able to operate from Japan, I think South Korea might not be free today. If Korean forces didn't hold the line on the peninsula, Japan would be a much less safe and prosperous country today. The DNA of these two alliances is intermingled, but it's complicated. General Chung was reminding me today that in the middle of the Korean War, the president at the time, Syngman Rhee, said, if Japanese troops land on the peninsula to help, he'll order the Korean army to attack them instead of North Korea. So it's two deeply interdependent alliances, but with a lot of difficult, complicating history. I'm not going to ask General Brooks to solve this problem because Admiral Kawano is going to solve it.
Yes, I'll save that for you, Kawano-san.
And it is a political problem, not a military problem, but it is a military problem in the sense that, will you tell me, what are the consequences for us, for the defense of Japan, the defense of Korea, and the security of the United States when our forces are not able to operate, train, share intelligence, exercise between these two alliances? Maybe start with you, General Brooks.
Well, thanks, Michael, for the privilege of being able to join such an august body here of patriots who've done tremendous work for each of our countries and for this cornerstone alliance. And it's a tremendous privilege to be with them. And the whole week has been like that, so it's just been wonderful, and this is a good continuation of it. Military issues often become geopolitical issues, and sometimes they can make the situation worse or they can make the situation better. And I would tell you first, it's been my experience both at U.S. Army Pacific and subsequently as the commander of United Nations Command to be able to see and witness and encounter these two critical alliances in Northeast Asia. And in many ways, as we watch the political tides ebb and flow as they are right now, we find that what is continuous is the military relationship. And so while these are indeed two distinct alliances, the U.S.-Japan alliance on one hand and the U.S.-Korean alliance on the other hand, there is coordination, there is cooperation to the extent that politics will allow among all three. It's not a triad alliance, that's not the case. And while that would be militarily efficient, it probably would not be very effective politically, socially. It has consequences nevertheless. So as we see this current situation where the relationship is bad, and I think I can't describe it any other way, bad and maybe getting worse if we want to add additional words to it, it puts several things at risk. First, the military communications that were ongoing will have to stop for a period of time or slow down, leaving a lack of coordination on very important information like, did you know that there are Chinese aircraft that are flying into the overlapped air defense identification zone that both countries share? Did you know that we're reacting to that now, or are you reacting to that now? Very simple things that we take for granted. Did you know that we have an aircraft emergency? And of course there are international aviation communications that occur, but there may need to be a recovery that occurs as well. And often we're going to find a military element might be the first to respond, best positioned or already on patrol in that area. How do you share that information if you can't talk? And I'm not talking about it from a technical means, I'm talking from a social and a political means. So we do see big consequences to the Cornerstone Alliance, which is U.S. and Japan, and the Linchpin Alliance, which is the United States and Republic of Korea, when they can't cooperate. We saw exploitation of that just last week as the Russians, in a coordinated exercise with the Chinese, decided to demonstrate they have the ability to fly in international airspace and to fly to within 12 nautical miles of a contested point on the surface of the water that is a point of friction between South Korea and Japan. In other words, Russia deliberately exploited the friction between those two countries. There are significant consequences to that militarily and geopolitically. So it's important that this is worked through, and as has been commented, it's not something that will happen quickly or easily. This is a very deep problem, and it requires the United States to understand the nature of that problem and to assist both countries in working through the painful recollections that underpin this problem that still is not completely resolved, but was believed to have been, and the great disappointment that happens on both sides. So we want to make sure that through conferences like this, that military leaders can keep a conversation going, and that we don't lose channels like the General Security of Military Information Agreement that is up for renewal between Japan and the Republic of Korea, and why that's so important to not destroy the channel, even if you limit what information is being shared. It's unwise to destroy the channel of communication. And I certainly hope, loving both alliances, that that will not happen, that we will not destroy, we will not see destruction of that channel of communication.
Thank you. Admiral Kawano.
まず日韓関係につきましては皆さんの認識と同じだと思いますけれども、今大変厳しい関係にあります。その中で
I think that the self-defense force and then also the ROK's forces have been having a very good relations. And John, defense chief, is now in office, and he was the chairman of the CSIS in Korea. And when I was an active duty officer, I have spoken with him very much about our situation, and we remain the very credible and also trustworthy friends. We still talk to each other very often. However, the relationship between the self-defense force and also our ROK forces, actually there was a very unfortunate situation that happened last year from my perspective. So we were invited to attend their vessel review to attend. However, we were asked to take down our flag to bring our ship closer to South Korea. You probably know this, but all our defense and also military people, our flags are our pride. So we wanted to show our pride by flying our flag and come to ROK. So I think this is a very common sense rule that we should respect to each other. So our conclusion was that we should reject the invitation to attend their military review. But we chose to stay in Japan and not attend the review because we wanted to maintain what was left between the relationship between ROK and also Japan. And also I have to mention that there was a radar lock-on incident between ROK and also onto the Japanese aircraft. So based on that incident, Japan requested South Korea to make their investigation and also make corrective action so that this will not repeat. But so far, the reactions and also handling from ROK has been beyond our imagination. And of course, we're here that we're hoping to resolve this issue. So we stopped having consultations at the end of January over this incident. So this is a very unfortunate situation. However, we still remember and also know that the collaboration between the United States, ROK, and Japan is still critical. Yes, we understand that situation between ROK and also Japan is very tough, but this 1965 agreement should be the guideline or guidance for us to move forward. But I think that there are some disruptive incidents or disruptive communications happen to sort of move us away from the what needs to be talked about and also resolved. So I really hope that we can still move forward by resolving what is happening right now.
I just exclamation point on this particular issue in a 3-day conference of the most experienced former military officers in the United States and Japan, surveying the field of geopolitical, technical, operational challenges to our security. The Japan-Korea relationship itself occupied a lot of time and a lot of attention. It's that important. As General Brooks put it, he loves the U.S.-Japan alliance, he loves the U.S.-Korea alliance. I think a lot of people in Washington feel that way. Don't know what the solution is, but the consequences of getting it right are pretty important. This is a combined arms operation. So we just had an Army-Navy team, U.S.-Japan. We're going to do Navy-Navy now. I'm going to ask Admiral Kawano a question and then Admiral Blair. So you still have operational control, Admiral. And the question for you, Admiral Kawano, is about the self-defense forces. As I said, the most respected institution, organization in Japan right now in polls. But one of the biggest challenges, of course, is people, getting enough people. And I've heard that in order to fully staff the defense forces, Japan will have to have the level of women participating in the military that, for example, the U.S. and Australia have. The U.S. and Australia have about 70%, I think, 17% of the force are women. And Japan's, I think, 6% or so. I'm asking in part because it's rare at CSIS. In fact, we never have panels that are all men anymore. And I am certain, we will probably, Yoichi and I get a lot of heat for that. And I'm certain sometime before too long we will have prominent representation not only from the U.S. but also Japan at the most senior levels of military leadership from women. But it's a pretty existential question actually right now for the self-defense forces. How to get more women empowered, engaged, promoted, retaining them in the self-defense forces. And you must have thought about that as chairman yourself. What are your views?
はい、まず今、我が国、少子化の問題が非常に深刻でありまして、自衛隊の隊員の適齢期の人たちを
Appropriate aged people to recruit to SDF is rather difficult, very difficult indeed. But when you look at the security environment surrounding Japan, we do need to enhance defense capability. Therefore, we do need to provide the extended defense capability, and that cannot be supported by male alone. In the future, we do need to have women's ability and women's capability included in the future. Dr. Green talked about 6% figure for the present level of women participation now. When I was still in active duty, our aim was 10%. I believe that we are now moving and taking measures so that we can increase it to 10%. Very recently, there were some area that was closed to women, which was submarine. Now it is open for women to take part. We do have women jet pilots. At present, the area that women cannot participate is the special forces, which requires a very severe environment of fighting. But in reality, in order for women to work in SDF with sense of security, we need to have something like nurseries, we need to provide some kind of facilities which would be required uniquely to women. Unless we can provide those services, I think women will have a very hard time trying to fulfill their responsibility. Therefore, we cannot make a major leap, but we would like to continue to increase the percentage for women participation.
Factor in Japan's ability to provide capabilities in this alliance. Turned to Admiral Blair, because on the U.S. side also, the force is under stress. Budgets are limited. The Chinese military buildup is unlike anything we've seen in recent memory. There's a debate among the experts about whether the U.S. forward presence in the Western Pacific, and in particular for the Navy, whether it should be, well, how much of it should be focused on high-end warfighting, and how much can we afford some of the traditional presence missions, shaping missions, showing the flag. What's your take on the proper mix of capabilities and the mix between that presence and phase zero shaping mission and the actual ability to prevail in a conflict?
Right, well, I think we must be able to, and we can, walk and chew gum at the same time in the Western Pacific. We've talked a lot about you can say deterring China, or I would prefer to say making China aware that they should pursue their national objectives by nonviolent methods. And that requires not only a certain number of the very best platforms in the Navy and the Marine and the Air Force forward station, but also capabilities in space and cyber warfare and all that are make it clear that if military aggression goes too far it will be stopped. But that's not the only thing that's important in the Pacific, and there are several items I would cite. Number one, the cooperation among the armed forces in the region on natural disasters, I think, is very important for the region. We've talked about the 3/11 tragedy. I am also reminded of the Christmas tragedy in 2003, 2004, when the tsunami devastated Aceh to the east and Sri Lanka to the west, and the response of military forces was really decisive in saving many lives in the immediate aftermath of that, and it was a tremendous operation of many countries that did that, and that's, I think, a responsibility that the armed forces owe not only to their own countries but to the countries of the region. A capable peacekeeping capability from among the countries of Asia is also, I think, important. When I was in command, we deployed that in East Timor, and I think it had a very decisive role in bringing a happy outcome both for the people of Timor-Leste and actually for the people of Indonesia, and that's an important activity that should include China, simply not directed to China. And then finally, I would say that even in this competition with China, as the term gray zone tactics, cabbage slicing tactics, this operation of forces below full military conflict level is something that the other countries of the region and the United States, which is interested in that part of the region, must present alternatives, must compete with China in doing, and this takes forces which are not the very top end. So I think American involvement in the region must be across the scale of capabilities of the armed forces, and I think it can be with smart management and resources that can be provided.
We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We're still going to need more gum, though, aren't we?
And better shoes.
Yeah, and more shoes, better shoes. Right. So go now to a joint Air Navy task force with General Iwasaki and Admiral Mullen. I want to ask if you could say a bit more about the jointness and interoperability issues between the U.S. and Japan, in particular for Iwasaki-san, collective self-defense. I worked in the Pentagon 20 years ago when the defense guidelines were revised. And a lot of us thought, finally we can do joint planning. And then we hit a wall called collective self-defense. But now Prime Minister Abe has opened up that issue, recognizing the right of collective self-defense. Are we ready for joint planning and joint operations? And for you, Admiral, the new midterm defense plan in Japan emphasizes cross-domain cyber space. What are your thoughts on where we need to prioritize and focus in those areas? Let's start with General Iwasaki, if we could.
この集団的自衛権というのは非常にですね
This collective self-defense is a very difficult area. When I was still in active duty, we have received many orders from the Prime Minister, and under the present constitution, could we actually exercise the collective self-defense was a question. Under the present constitution, only the individual self-defense was something that we could exercise. That was our thought for a long time. However, as we think further, maybe part of the collective self-defense could be exercised, and that was some of the result of the research. And 3 years ago, we have actually introduced the Peaceful Security Act. And that under that law, that is something that we could do at the most under the present constitution. So compared to the overall collective self-defense, this is only part of the overall collective defense, self-defense. But now we can exercise some collective self-defense. If we utilize present legislation, under what circumstances, to what extent could we exercise such? For example, they may have to be considered individually. In regarding the cyber domain, what kind of cooperation can we have between Japan and U.S.? Regarding space, what can we do together? Or maybe possibly in the Strait of Hormuz, what can we do together? So individual cases must be considered to see to what extent self-defense forces could be utilized, and those decisions will have to be made on individual cases. Even up until now, the use of self-defense force will change from what it used to be in the past.
That I have operated with and then strategically been with the self-defense force, I've always been impressed with the capability. We have some history that in the self-defense force days prior to collective defense, those operations actually went pretty well. And in particular, what I would call the Navy to Navy, the maritime operations and in the maritime domain. So, and that's a significant part of the challenge right now, just because of the theater laydown itself. So I'm actually hopeful that if we could both now collectively plan and exercise, and I'm specifically, I believe we need a permanent joint and combined task force in the region, which we could use regularly to test these things. And interoperability is always challenging, no matter when you start, and wringing that out early, even in quote unquote the conventional days, it just takes time. It takes a lot of effort to do that, and you can't theoretically get at that. You have to practice regularly. The level of professionalism, and I watched this in the 311 response, the level of professionalism inside both of our forces is extraordinary. So I think we could solve that relatively quickly. When you specifically ask about the gray zone pieces, the space piece, the cyber piece, we've started to talk about the electronic warfare piece as well. Those are all, in terms of operating together, they're very new. The thing that drives that, particularly in cyber, is the speed. You don't have a lot of time to adjust. There's the serious issue of defense and offense, and constitutionally right now, the Japanese Constitution will not allow offensive operations. We in the U.S. have very recently, from my perspective, I think with this administration, got to a point where we're much more open about either using it or certainly planning to use offensive operations in the cyber world, which I think we need to do. I think, we've given certainly the Russians and the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans far too much runway in the cyber world, and they need to be pushed back pretty hard, quite frankly. So that's all right there. I think we know what we need to do, but we're just going to have to practice together. And it isn't just the constitutional. It isn't just the constitutional requirements in Japan with respect to something like cyber going on offense. I think what Americans need to think about is the history in this country, with an understanding of that history, evolution over the last 70 years. It's topical right now, obviously, in the South Korean, Japanese challenges that are ongoing. But to make sure we have an understanding of that as we look to how much we can actually get done, how quickly we can actually move. And that creates additional complexity that I think, if we consider that, there's likely to be a much more rapid solution to these very, very challenging problems. So we know, I talked about information sharing earlier. We've networked before, we've shared information before. So the basics, I think, are there. It's a question of now, can we, given the threat, and it's considerable and it's growing, and we need to work together, and it's not just the two of us or the three of us. There are others that you can't do that on paper. You've got to actually practice it, and I think that's what we got to do.
When you mentioned a standing joint task force, are you thinking bilateral U.S.-Japan, or maybe bigger? Or?
My view of this needs to be joint, combined. Certainly there's a bilateral piece as well, but we've just been in too many coalition operations in the last, since the 90s that I can count, where that just becomes, that almost becomes a mandate. And critical to success, because all these things in the end have to end politically. And the political capital that a country puts into a coalition with its forces is considerable. And without that, I also believe, you don't have the political resolve to achieve what you're trying to achieve. So I think it's much more, in the long run, it's, and hopefully not so long, but the long run, it's much more beyond just the bilateral relationship between us and Japan. I think it's got to be a lot of other countries as well.
This is a very purple stage. These distinguished officers have all had some of the most, in many cases, the most important joint jobs you can have in either country, but I'm going to be a little parochial at the end and end with the Army and ask General Brooks and General Yoichi about the role of ground forces in this competition we face with China, both the defense of the island chain, but also shaping the environment. People often think of the Pacific as a Navy air theater in Washington. That's not the whole picture at all. So, General Brooks, why don't you start us off? How do we think about ground forces, U.S. and Japan, in what we're facing?
Well, thanks for that. And certainly that was a focus of my attention as the commander of U.S. Army Pacific, just as it was when I was the commander of U.S. Army Central in the Middle East and Central Asia. The space is more concentrated in the Middle East and Central Asia, but it requires a joint approach to get the job done. I found that to be the case certainly as well in the Pacific, if not more so. And I'll just highlight a couple of reasons why that it's critically important that we think about this in a joint approach. First, that's a decided advantage for the U.S. and any of its allies, is to operate in a joint context. That may change over time, and we find that potential adversaries, like the People's Liberation Army, are pursuing jointness in their own way, but they're studying our model because it's a decided advantage at the present time. And so we need to do it because that's how we operate. Secondly, when we think about the interdependencies that happen among the various services and their capabilities, we'd be foolish to go without any one of them. And so whether it's recognizing the way the geographic space is in these island chains, as you call them, the part of the Pacific we're describing is all about archipelagos, from the Aleutians all the way down to Indonesia. And they are pieces of ground that are separated by water. Now, that's how I look at it as a landsman, but that's also how the people who live on it look at it, because we're talking about populations here. We also find that on the landmass, many of the countries are dominated militarily by their armies. And having a relationship with those continental leaders is critically important if we want to think about access, basing, overflight, a longer term relationship that creates stability in the region that is deterrent in nature. You ought to have a relationship if you want to have that. So land forces play a very, very important role in that, and that's both the U.S. and the Japanese, and I would say others in the region as well, as we knitted together a tighter community of armies. Lastly, I'll say that certainly we see an emergence of some adaptations of forms of war. And for example, the multi-domain operations concept is really about land forces being able to have an impact on the domains that would normally be dominated by other services. So land forces can impact air, sea, space, and cyber, if they're positioned in the right places with the right types of systems and are integrated into a joint operating concept by whatever commander you have, a standing joint force commander, a combatant commander, an alliance commander. They have to be integrated in. And so whether it's long-range fires or air defense systems or electronic warfare capabilities or landing different communications, all these things are dependent upon a connection to land forces to enable the joint fight. So it might well be, and we certainly saw this when I was at U.S. Army Pacific within what was then called PACOM, now Indo-Pacific Command, that we did better in our exercises when we were thinking that way. How could I, as a landsman, a land component commander, enable the operations of a maritime component commander or an air component commander? How could we all fuse the capabilities that we had in space and to protect them at the same time in a collective way? And we see these concepts now resident in the National Strategy for the Indo-Pacific as released by the U.S. Department of Defense. And we see it also in the defense planning guidelines from Japan as well. So recognition that this is a requirement for the way we're going to operate for the rest of the century calls for a much closer integration than we can see. Now, let me just make one last comment on our previous question. I'm neither from the Navy, nor am I a woman, but I am from the first class that included women at the U.S. Military Academy, and trust me, you'll be glad you did it when you make the change. Okay, you ought to do it soon, don't fight it, take advantage of it, it will make you much better, and I look forward to seeing the future highly improved Japan self-defense forces that have a 17% or 30% composition of women.
Thank you. Yoichi-san.
はい。私の方は今のお話の続きの部分とそれからホイップの部分と分けてお話ししたいと思っていずれにしても陸軍とか海兵隊というのは地味なんです。
Army and also Marines, I think that they receive less spotlight than the other arms of the forces. But I have to say that the most hardworking people are actually the armies because they have very difficult missions because they have to face two other soldiers face to face. So then when we ask for more budget, then they tell us, what are you doing? You don't really need that much. So that's the response that we receive. But I have to say, from the ground, we take so much, and also we are prepared for so much. And when we look at this security environment, Marines and also air, sea, and also ground, and then we are now including cyber and space. And when we look at latest technology, 5G and also AI, so those are adding more complex aspects to what security means. So that means we cannot just conclude our mission just within the lands, and we cannot just silo our operations or missions within our limits. We always have to integrate, to have joint forces so that we can have the most effective war fighting or the strategy. So I think this is what joint planning and also joint operations mean to us. And what is the heart of this joint work? We have to think about command and control. This is the core and the heart of our joint operation and also joint collaboration. So this is what it means to us as control. And from control, then we have to spread out some of the works to our units and also smaller groups so that they can work on their tasks. So in this era, all the aspects are interdependent, and then not only war fighting, but at the same time, defense and also deterrence. We should think about from the system and also what kind of concept we have to have for our joint capabilities. And not only Japan and the United States, and also ASEAN included.
出ました。で、日本の考え
And when I think about this region from different perspective, I think Japan has 3 pillars to look at in the Pacific. So, for example, freedom of navigation and also prosperity in terms of the economic aspect. And Indian Ocean is, of course, connected to the Middle East. So we're not only talking about economic activities in the Asian region, but we're looking at the global scale and also the stability and also prosperity. What's asked of us, meaning the Japan self-defense, is that we should contribute to the global prosperity in so many different ways, including freedom of navigation and also economy and also security. So what we have been working on as the Japan Self-Defense Force is that we have been working together with Southeast Asian countries. We have dispatched engineers and also healthcare professionals so that those countries can learn and also grow their expertise in those fields. And of course that we're not just dispatching people for a short period of time, but we are sending them so that they can assimilate it or maybe include it in their cultures too. And of course that the U.S.-Japan alliance is the core, but for example, Australia, the Philippines should be included in our perspective. And also we should look at the multilateral collaboration surrounding us. So this is the stability and also securing peace in the region. And also last year we saw some special activities. We sent a small unit to India for training. So this is a very encouraging sign that we have been very active to communicate with those Southeast Asian countries. And also the relationship with the U.S. Army. We have done some joint exercises. 2 weeks ago or so, I was asked to give a keynote speech in Tokyo. At that time, HADR, which is disaster recovery and also humanitarian assistance in a mega city. So this keynote speech was actually held by a huge think tank and also other organizations in Japan. Many countries came, and also many NGOs came to hear my speech. So this type of humanitarian assistance and also disaster recovery are very much interested by so many different organizations, and also they come together in that same mission. And so I really would like to see the United States and also Japan to leverage on that, because there's that sense of mission already growing.
Yeah, I just asked Mike if I could make a comment about our Army, and that is not a natural question, you might think, but it was a few years ago, actually when I was running our Navy, that I publicly made a speech in the middle of war. This was in the middle of war in Iraq, that I was completely convinced, and this goes to Vince's comment about the criticality of armies globally and the upside and the downside of Army presence. But I made a speech saying that, contrary to my training as a young naval officer, particularly in the budget world, what I realized was our Army in the United States, my Army when I became chairman, was the center of gravity of our military. I believed it then, I believe it now. I also, and this is just an anecdote, again about how peoples around the world feel about armies. When we had that tragic earthquake in Haiti, everybody was moving as many forces as possible to try to help, we sent a ready brigade of the 82nd Airborne down to Haiti to help. And I visited them a few days later, and in my interaction with the Haitian people, I was stunned at the numbers who thought we were going to invade them or had invaded them. And it was a very serious concern and discussion. And I could not relieve that concern, literally, until all the 82nd Airborne soldiers were off the island. And that was a message to me, again, about the impact of armies, both, again, the upside and the downside, and the fears and concerns that they raise, again, for both good and for concern. And then lastly, in this world that we are now in of remote weapons, unmanned capability, the kind of precision and lethality we see in these weapons, when we're in combat, one of the things, and this isn't a perfect solution, but one of the things I learned is I really need people on the ground. I really want to have a level of knowledge about the destruction that I am about, in particular in a world where, as precise and as lethal as these weapons are, there is oftentimes collateral damage. I value, back to what I said earlier about my Army being the center of gravity of our military, I value that more than I ever thought I would, and they bring extraordinary capability. However you would distribute them, whatever impact they have in countries around the world, we cannot do this without them. Even in a theater that is oftentimes characterized as a Navy and an Air Force theater.
Thank you. If I were to try to wrap a ribbon around what we've been discussing, number one, we need the Army. That's for sure.
Thank you.
But the theme would be jointness, and not just saying jointness as a kind of lip service, but talking about it because the PLA is rapidly increasing capability. North Korea is expanding its nuclear arsenal. Our budgets aren't going up at the same rate as the Chinese, and jointness is capability. It is a multiplier, and not just the US and Japan, but that's why the relationship with Korea matters. That's why, as Oriki-san said, India, Australia, others matter. I think that, just as an observer and participant the past few days, that's a mega theme. That looking at the problems, whether it's new domains like space and cyber, increasing in defense spending and capabilities by China? The answer very often is improving our jointness and our ability to work together, especially US-Japan, but networking this alliance with allies and partners elsewhere. Let's take questions from the audience. We have microphones. If you could identify yourself, and if you want to pick someone to ask, go ahead. If not, I'll toss it to someone on the panel, and then anyone can weigh in. Let's get way in the back there.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful panel, Dr. Funabashi and Mike. And also thank you for the wonderful panelists on the stage. My name is Satohiro Akimoro. I'm a president of Sasagawa Peace Foundation USA. My question is with regard to Korea-Japan relationship, particularly to the possible role that the United States can play. And the question is addressed to Admiral Mullen and Admiral Blair. I think most people in Japan agree that Korea-Japan relationship is critically important for Korea-Japan stability of the region and also United States. Number two, that it's a serious state that we need to do something. As Admiral Kawano said, that there's a fundamental gap between the two countries. And number three, that if we don't do anything, a third country will take advantage of it. Having said that, it looks like Korea and Japan have demonstrated that they can't solve this on their own. Is there, did you discuss any possible role for United States to better the relationship between Korea and Japan? Japanese have been, I think, frustrated to the extent that they've been basically asking Americans for some time to play a role, but situation has come to the point that we witnessed today. So is there any role that the United States can play? Did you discuss possibility of the United States play any mediation role? Thank you very much.
You want to start?
Sure. I think fundamentally this is a situation that Koreans and Japanese have to resolve. We have an incredibly strong relationship with both countries. So I haven't obviously been involved, but I guess I'm comfortable enough to say that this is not out there by itself, that we are paying a lot of attention to it, and that there are individuals involved because I think we all recognize how serious this is and the direction that it's heading is very dangerous. So, but in the end, I think probably, and I'm not on the inside, I would work very hard to support the solution that independently the Koreans and the Japanese need to figure out. And there are ways to do that, and I'm not involved enough to know how much there is, but there certainly is activity that we're very much aware of from that standpoint. So it's not out there by itself.
Right. We discussed some of the principles that should guide American participation, or the American role in trying to help two of our closest allies in the theater. I think one principle is the United States should distinguish carefully between what should be done publicly and what should be done privately. The issues between Korea and Japan have a high historical, emotional, political, social context, and an outside country comments and prescribes in those areas at its peril, and I don't think we should. On the other hand, on a private basis, I think the United States, and we discussed this in our group, should provide a sense of urgency for working on the problem, and in many cases, a venue and a sympathetic third party to help solutions be achieved by both countries. I think as far as our public role, again, that sense of urgency is important to talk about publicly. The sense of the importance issue to the United States should be talked about publicly, and we should emphasize it. And when one country or the other takes an action that is really affects the long-term repair of relations between the countries, I think we should call it out. I agree completely with General Brooks that eliminating existing channels of military information exchange between Japan and Korea is a terrible mistake. Of course, the information that goes on that channel can be regulated and would be regulated based on a whole bunch of factors, but we're publicly against that. We don't think the Republic of Korea should terminate that agreement. And so those are the principles that we discussed, and that's the role that I think the United States can play. I think finally I would say that there is an overall feeling among us Americans who have service and friendships with Koreans and with Japanese that this thing just is not going to lead to a final and total rupture. There is just too much that the three vibrant free market democracies in the most important part of the world share for that not to eventually, over time, overcome these very difficult historical problems which they face.
私の意見ですが、もしかこの日韓問題にアメリカが仲介に入ったとしても、一時的には良くなるかもしれませんが、根本的解決は
try to improve the situation, but I think that will not solve the issue from the root.
We just heard from Admiral Kawano, and what I heard from Admiral Mullen and Admiral Blair was that the U.S. has a role to play, but it's not to broker this, which ultimately will have to be done by Japan and Korea. At CSIS, every few years we survey hundreds and hundreds of foreign policy experts in Asia about their vision for the future of the region, 10 countries. The countries that are most closely aligned, almost indistinguishable about what kind of Indo-Pacific they want, with democratic rule of law, with a strong American presence. The two countries where the experts are most closely aligned is Japan and Korea. Even more so than Australia. I'm sorry, Michael. Although that may say more about Australian foreign policy elites answering the survey than the Australian people. But it's remarkable. It's almost identical to responses from Japan and Korea about the role of the United States, about the democratic values, about the kind of economies they want to see, the kind of institutions they want to see. Almost identical, the Japanese and Korean foreign policy experts, about where they'd like this region to go and the role of the U.S. So, to Admiral Blair's point, there is an underlying set of values, but also interests that really, hopefully, will get us past this. Let's keep going, and yes, we have to. We can always count on Mainichi Shimbun to ask a question that makes me glad I'm not in government now.
Yoso Furumoto, Mainichi newspaper's reporter. I want to ask a question about President Trump, very simply. Is President Trump strengthening or weakening U.S.-Japan alliance? To anyone who wants to make a comment.
You don't want to ask about INF or Iran or something easy? That's an air ball. Anyone can go for it who wants to.
No, I'll take a crack at that. A couple things from this week. We heard from a number of administration officials, and what I was struck by was the continuity of policy in terms of lots of things that are going on. Specifically, our national security strategy, our national defense strategy, the guidelines that just came out of Japan recently, those documents playing off each other, and I think that has strengthened the relationship, put us in a position to strengthen the relationship. And then I would go back even before what I said earlier in terms of generally continuity, not perfect continuity from one administration to another, but that values the relationship. I think very publicly there probably hasn't been a leader in the world that has worked harder on a relationship with our president than Prime Minister Abe. And to great success for the alliance specifically, and then for the region, obviously because of the criticality of that alliance. It's almost easier now to criticize because the vulnerabilities that have always been there, China being one, the challenges we're having right now with respect to the relations between South Korea and Japan, what's going on in North Korea, a lot of it's more public than it's ever been, so it's easier to see. So I mean, overall, I'm taken back by the continued strength of the alliance in an evolving time. So I would, on balance, say it certainly is as strong or stronger, or getting stronger over time.
All that being said, withdrawing from TPP, I think, was a very big mistake, and that one that we are scrambling to recover from. And so it's been, I think Admiral Mullen correctly characterized some of the positive aspects, but that one big own goal, that one big foot shot, I think was a mistake by this administration, whatever one thinks of the possibility of treaty passage had it been passed.
There are a lot of ranchers and farmers who would agree with you. It's not just geopolitical.
日米安保条約にで会場の方が詳しくはご存じないと思いますが、
One knows the details of that treaty, but in summary, if Japan is attacked, then the United States come to rescue. However, in return, Japan offers the military facilities to the United States, so this is balanced. When you boil it down, so operation part is still unfair or imbalanced. In my personal opinion, this operation domain should be reviewed so that the balance should be a little bit more equal. For that, peace legislation was enacted so that we can give support to protect the United States ships and also aircrafts even at peacetime. So what President Trump said about the U.S.-Japan alliance is that he was very sharp to point that out, and then so I received that message personally.
TVs. Because I don't think Sony's made TVs since the 1980s. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen. I heard through the grapevine that Japan's military budget is 1% of Japan's GDP. I feel that their hands, the military hands, are tied in the back for some reason. That's the way I feel anyway, but how do you feel about that, increasing to maybe up to 2% of GDP?
Everyone's looking at me, so now I have to answer that question. Yes. That 1% that you mentioned, it is not legally bound, and it has been just a political trend and also inertia. And also, we have to think about that the growth itself of the GDP, and so that means even though it may be remaining at 1%, the GDP itself has been growing, so meaning that the defense budget is growing as well. And we cannot really achieve 2%, whatever the calculation that we may want to take. And so we can probably have 1.3%. And then also, it depends on what kind of calculation that you're using. But I do understand your points, and so the Japan renewed its midterm defense force build-up program, and so within that, we now have included different types of activities or new activities. So we should not think about what percentage point that we should aim for in terms of the defense budget, but we should look at what kind of capacities and also what we need to do as defense. So that's my understanding. And so we can just throw out some numbers, 2% or whatever it is, but 2% doesn't really give us any justification. That would be the sound budget point that we should have. So I think that this comes from President Trump's comment to the NATO that every country should contribute by 2% of their own GDP. But this doesn't really give us a justification to have that kind of discussion. And if we would like to achieve 2% over 10 years, that means we should increase the actual budget by 7% or 8% every year to actually achieve 2% of Japan's GDP. So when we look at the actual economic status of Japan, increasing the Japan's budget, defense budget by 7% to 8% every year is very difficult. So we should not just look at 1% of the Japanese GDP, but we should look at what we truly need to do in defense. And so that's why I was trying to explain that to the Treasury ministry in Japan.
A crisis, shrinking their GDP. So be careful what you wish for. I like the way that Admiral Mullen, this is how a joint and combined task force works. Admiral Mullen saw the difficult question and immediately designated General Oriki, who jumped right in without any hesitation. That's the right vision for our alliance. Yes, sir.
Let me just add, if I can just add on to that as well. I think one of the important points here is, as we're thinking about numbers, and I certainly agree with General Oriki, that we ought to be careful about random numbers, but these are not new numbers. We've been trying to seek all of our alliances to commit to a level of effort that is reflected by a 2% baseline. So that's the objective, to get everyone spending at about that amount. But there's a deeper underlying question that's behind that, and that is, what is a reasonable amount of support to U.S. forces? What is a reasonable amount of commitment to self-defense through every aspect of that? And I think we've still got a lot of work to do globally, especially beginning with the alliances, to understand what that means. And we had some discussion about that during the forum this week on, are we counting everything properly? Are we including everything that is being done in basing, in access, in tariffs, in trade, everything? Are we really including it all in a way that's comprehensive enough to be able to see what the true level of effort is? And I would submit to you that having carried this message around the world to a number of militaries for a number of years, we don't include everything that ought to be included. And so we've got work to do to refine our understanding of what that fair commitment, that fair load really is. In some cases, we miss things that have been very beneficial to the United States. We just don't acknowledge them. We walk right past them because we're looking for a specific thing, which is a % of spending on procurement or what have you. And that's not adequate. So we need to be, I think, much more insightful in this part of the century and beyond, as we, in my view, refresh the alliance structures that are so important to stability and prosperity in the world. We've got to look at it in a more comprehensive way than we have in the past.
That, General, sounds like a good mission for a national security think tank.
Yes, maybe CSIS would take that.
Please, in the middle there, Josh.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intel analyst and a former diplomat. We mentioned radar. Equally important, and perhaps even more important, is tracking submarine coming out of North Korea or Bohai Bay, and passing that contact as it goes along the coast of Korea onto Japan. I want to be assured that that capability is bulletproof, that no amount of political exigencies are going to disturb that is permanent infrastructure. Can the mantle here assure us that that kind of tactical effort is, in fact, sacred?
No, we're not going to answer that question in tactical detail. The overall assurance that the United States and the other countries that we operate with can handle the undersea domain, I can tell you, is good. But I'm not going to go into detail with you.
Is it right to think that that undersea domain is one of our real advantages going forward, particularly when you look not only at U.S. Navy capabilities but the Maritime Self-Defense Forces as well, Australian Navy, Indian, and so forth?
Yes, I mean this is an extremely complex and difficult part of the Navy operating space, in which equipment is a part of the equation. The Chinese equipment is not as advanced as what the other countries have. But even more than that, it is the long years of practice and training that go into that.
And it's not subjected to political whims.
No.
No, it's actually what I said earlier. In just this week, what I've seen, hearing from this administration, and then knowing what's existed in administrations before, all of that continues to be in place, and I would argue mostly undisturbed.
It's a good thing about politics. If you can't see it, it doesn't exist. I see a hand way back there.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Pat Host. I'm a reporter with Jane's. I have a question for our Japanese friends. So Japan wants to acquire a new fighter jet. I was wondering what you think Japan should prioritize in capabilities for this new aircraft, and perhaps how you think the acquisition should be procured. Thank you.
Iwasaki-san, you're the only Air Force guy up here.
最も嫌な質問だというふうに思いますけれども、ですね、
When we think about the fighter aircraft in Japan, we do not have a large fleet at all. When I count the number of aircraft, then that means less than 400. And the mission that we receive is meaning that protecting the air. For example, China, Russia can be threatening, so that we have to protect our territory to counter them. And so when we think about the threats in the current situation, we have to expand our capacity, that's for sure. So I think that it is more effective to have one type of aircraft rather than various types of aircrafts for cost benefit and also efficiency. If we have one type of aircraft, and we have an issue, because if that type of aircraft have an issue with the wings, then we have to ground all the aircraft of that same type. And when we have a scramble situation, then we have to be able to mobilize our aircraft as well. And so I think that we should not rely on just one type of aircraft, but maybe we have to have various types, maybe up to 3 types of aircraft. And even if we acquire different types of aircraft, we would not have the expertise to operate them efficiently. So we should seek technical support as well. So that's why we have decided that we will maintain to hold 3 types of aircraft into the future as well. And when we talk about FX, this is F2 type of aircraft. So this was called FSX in the past. Back in 1987. So FSX came in. This is based on F16. And this was redesigned for the advanced type. When we think about fighter jets, we used to have the criteria or categories as FI and also FS. So FS means fighter support, and also FI means interception. And so S means support. We used to have F1 by Mitsubishi or MHI. And so this is going to be retired. So Japan is planning to update the design of F-16 and also produce them in Japan. This is agreed upon between Japan and the United States. Looking toward 2030, so there may be some types of aircraft retiring. But we just started our renewed design of F-16, and also I think that it will take about 10 years to complete that program. And so we have been working together with the United States to complete it. And last year we renewed our National Defense Program guidelines and also a midterm Defense Force Build-Up Program. Within those literature, for our next generation FX, Japan should take the primary role to actually produce and also maintain those aircrafts. Because we would be able to customize those aircrafts for our unique needs. MRJ is produced by MHI. Now it's called SpaceJet. MHI produced these space jets domestically. There are some misunderstanding that these are produced internationally, but this is domestic produce. So MHI has worked with 18 companies to produce these, and so for some parts, for example, wings and such, were technically supported by other companies. So what we are trying to do right now is that how and also what kind of aircraft that we can design and also produce so that the Japan can take the primary role in this. But at the detailed level, I cannot share more than this. So did I answer my question? Answer your question?
Ask, the fighter aircraft is only one example, but systems integration with each new generation of a platform gets almost exponentially more difficult, so that, for example, JSF is a joint strike fighter, and allies can't afford to do some of these alone anymore. I'm directing this first to General Brooks because, in the U.S.-Korea alliance or in NATO, we have something closer to a joint requirements dialogue. It's not quite joint, I think, in reality, but we think about requirements and how those affect procurement in a little more integrated way than I think we do in the U.S.-Japan alliance. And both alliances well. Is there room for us to think more jointly about requirements than we do now between the U.S. and Japan, recognizing we're not going to have a joint requirements process like NATO and US-RK necessarily?
Right, so I don't think we'll go as far as that, at least not in the near term, for a joint requirements process, but as we are working through exercises, we can see that first there would have to be an integration that connects the Japan Air Self-Defense Force and its aircraft, the full fleet, to the Ground Self-Defense Force. If Japan is to secure within its own archipelago, maneuver within its own archipelago to defend Japan or respond to a crisis within the archipelago, greater situational awareness is important. And many of these new generation aircraft and weapon systems have these capabilities built in, but are they built to connect to another domain? And so we see that as a very important part of the design. And I'm confident Japan will take that on as they think through their own approaches to improving jointness and joint interoperability. But when you get to the alliance part, there's an added complexity, because that's hard enough on finding ways to move awareness from one domain into another in a way that both are operating with the best possible knowledge and understanding. It's even harder when you do it in an alliance. So what exactly can be shared? What protocols? What technical mechanisms make it possible for this awareness to be moved from one country's database to another for immediate use without latency, which is the expectation in modern warfare and modern response operations. And I would say it applies to both of those, by the way. How did you do that? And how do you have that kind of a conversation? So this is what these relationships are about within an alliance. We have to have hard conversations about our ability to work together. And oddly enough, we have limitations even on long-standing alliances in NATO as well as in the U.S.-Korea alliance, and that certainly applies in the U.S.-Japanese alliance as well. We have to find ways to work through that. Please.
少しおっしゃいます。ですね、我々の戦闘機というのはですね、当然のことながら、例えば私は空幕長の時に。
When I was the air chief of staff, I decided to introduce F-35. Introduce the A type of F-35. F-35. Compared to the history of these fighters, especially by the U.S. Air Force, F-14, 15, 18, A-10 for air. They were third and fourth generation. And there was also a continuous, so I do not think that that is a Generation 5, which is a continuation of the other. F-35 is a little different. So what we are going to be creating is going to be something that is beyond the concept of fighters as we used to have. What would be required then? We do have a defense concept, and how we self-defense forces will fight is indicated in the concept. We will fight on our own, and we will jointly work. That would involve interoperability. So we need to be able to cover and overcome all of these concepts and needs in the fighter. So whatever way you want to make this fighter, if we cannot jointly work or combine with U.S., or if we cannot work together with the air, sea, etc., then that would not be sufficient. We need to have a fighter which would be able to enable all of those joint or capabilities.
We have a couple of thanks to do before we wrap up. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Quickly, yeah.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to take a very blunt approach in my question, because, I mean, I'm very thankful that there's dialogue between Japan and the U.S., but my question is, I mean, China is still bullying countries in the Southeast Asia. My question is about leveraging the insider role of Japan and taking a regional military leadership role in the region. Because from what I know is that, I mean, China is still staunchly defending its like 9-yard meter defense, and no countries can come near to that 9-yard distance. And there was recently a meeting among the Southeast Asian nations, China stressing that, defending their space. But the other thing too is that China has a very special relationship with Japan, that there was an agreement that before China attacks or gives a signal, they will give like a 24 to 48 hours alert to Japan. So my question is, and then Japan is also the second largest trade partner of China. So my question is, honestly, what is Japan, how can U.S. leverage your insider role in the region with these countries being bullied by China and develop you into a regional leader, military leader in that region, promoting the U.S. interest, democracy, and Western values and all that?
Japan's doing a lot in the Philippines.
I know.
In that example, and you're thinking even more broadly. Does anyone want to respond on how, from U.S. or Japanese perspective, Japan can play more of a leadership role in Southeast Asia in these challenges?
I'll start. Number one, a couple of things I need to correct. The Chinese 9-dash line claim encompasses the entire South China Sea, and all countries operate in there. China does not successfully exclude countries. The United States sends both civilian and military ships and aircraft through there. So does Japan. So do others. Now, many of them are challenged by China, and of course, China bullies Philippine fishermen and so on. But that's an area as big as the Mediterranean. It's a huge area, and countries do operate there.
But that's still international space. But China is just bullying.
Yeah, but they're not winning. They're not winning. More and more other countries are putting more and more ships out there. But your basic point, I think, is correct. Is that the way to handle this unilateral Chinese approach is with a combined, coordinated effort of those other countries which think that ought to be free and open international space in accordance with the UN Commission on Law and the Sea, and that they need to work together in order to assert that right. And the balance between outside countries like the United States and Japan and the countries who live there, like the Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam, is a delicate balance. But I think that both the United States and Japan are treading that balance pretty well by helping build capacity and resilience within the countries concerned. Areas like increasing maritime domain awareness, which is helping countries understand what actually is going on, increasing Coast Guard capabilities there, and meanwhile sending their own both Navy ships and Coast Guard ships and aircraft into the area. So I think China is encountering large pushback to these claims, which you correctly cite, or that they claim the entire area within the 9-dash line, which encompasses the whole South China Sea. But what I think we're seeing now, and this is a movie, not a snapshot, is a very strong pushback with a lot of both individual activity by outside seafaring countries, support for the countries in the region, and then cooperation among them. So it's a movie that's going on, and I think the ending of it will be favorable over time to the United States and Japan and the countries in the region who don't want to be bullied and coerced by China, but more work is required.
So, yeah, please, Kawano-san, and then we'll conclude.
まず日本は海洋国家です。で、我々の最大の価値観は海洋の自由。
The ocean, and we need to protect, defend. We need to defend the freedom of sea. Japan is a country surrounded by the ocean, and the value for Japan is to protect the freedom of sea. And I believe that is a value that is common with that of the United States. In the South China Sea and in Indian Ocean, we are not intending to take an initiative on our own. However, in the South and East China Sea and in the Indian Ocean, we will enhance the presence of our naval capabilities in order to sort of deter China. This is something that we have not seen in the past, and I think we will continue to do that in the years to come. And countries in ASEAN such as Vietnam and India and Sri Lanka These will be the countries that we will have cooperation in the military sphere, and or we may have a joint exercise. And in order to enhance that, we hope to be able to confront the values of China, and ultimately, we hope that China will come close to the values that we hold in this area.
I have to end with a few thanks. I want to thank everyone on the panel, including for their service over 250 years, and that's just Admiral Mullen, over 250 years of combined service up here. Thank the translators who have been doing an excellent job all day. I want to thank our joint and combined task force of API and CSIS RAs and interns, and Yoichi and Nick Sancheni and Yoichi Funabashi for really making this all happen. So thank you.